All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I am here at Art Southeast in a solo exhibition, Bodyjumpers by Leia Genis. It's on display through June 15th here in Savannah. And I am joined by the artist herself, Leia from Atlanta. She's in her studio. And we're here today to unpack this work a little bit. So just to give a brief introduction, Leia is a trans artist and writer currently based in Atlanta, Georgia, a graduate of Savannah College of Art and Design with degrees in painting and sculpture. Her artwork has been exhibited nationally and internationally at venues such as Mocha GA in Atlanta and the Ipswich Biennale in Ipswich, UK. Her artworks have been written about in Elephant Magazine, Gallery Magazine, Sugarcane Magazine, and other publications, and her writing has been published in Freeze, Burnaway, Art Papers, and Numbers Inc. magazine. Genis is currently a full-time studio artist, and in addition to her artistic endeavors, she's an avid cyclist with a competition history at the national level. So Leia, thank you for joining us today.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Hello.
So would you like to maybe start by unpacking, you have a really powerful and beautiful artist statement for the exhibition. Would you like to maybe start by unpacking the title, Bodyjumpers, and where that came from?
Yeah, absolutely. So the title comes from an anecdote. This last year, I was hanging out with my friend Kitty. Kitty's a musician, and so I attended one of her performances, and afterwards we were kind of just hanging out and talking. And this was early on into my friendship with Kitty, so there was a lot of just kind of the get to know you, exchange of information stuff that we were talking about. And when she found out that my birthday was in early June, she said, "Oh, you're a Gemini. All Gemini are body jumpers." And I'm not really an astrology person. Not that I have any particular issues with it. It's just not something I've like really gripped onto or latched onto. Um, so I really hesitate to like either agree or disagree with that statement, whether Geminis are body jumpers. But just hearing the term body jumper really like struck a chord with me as like a perfect summary of the ways in which I experience and live as a trans person. Um, and I think this is something that a lot of minorities end up doing where they have to kind of like morph and shape their identity a lot, right? Like with Black people, they talk a lot about the double consciousness in which you're, living in your present self, but then you're also always, you have the second level of consciousness in which you're always aware of how your present self is being perceived in, a predominantly white supremacist society. And so like there's a term for that, and a lot of different minorities have different like experiences with that. But the term body jumpers really struck me because I think the trans community as a whole does a lot more emphasis on the physical alteration of bodies in order to like fit within an oppressive society than other minorities do. For example, I'm a trans person on HRT, and HRT is a process in which you medically alter the hormone levels within your body. And so in my case, I'm an MTF trans person. And so in my case, that's, artificially lowering my testosterone levels and artificially raising my estrogen levels. And that's just part of like gender affirming care, right? Like that's something that makes me feel more at home in my body. But it also like has ramifications in like how I'm perceived, right? Like that has had physical effects on the way that my body, like my silhouette looks and the way that my voice sounds, the way that my face looks, things like that. Um, and that's just something that I think trans people deal with much more directly than a lot of other minorities, and where like the physical alteration of a body to fit more comfortably, I guess, within a norm is like very, very present. And that even like, HRT is like a durational, long-term process, but it even happens in like the much shorter or the much smaller scale where like things such as wardrobe choices, where it's like, what type of wardrobe am I going to wear today? And like, what type of image am I going to present with this wardrobe? Like that kind of like performative gender roles is definitely something that a lot of trans people do. So it has scales and degrees of impact, I guess, where it can go from the small individual short-term decisions to the large longitudinal decisions. But that term body jumper, that when Kitty said it, really just kind of felt like the perfect way to describe that process of, existing in one body and like having to consciously jump to another one, day in, day out, or year in, year out, to like kind of fit within this, predominantly cis-normative society that we live in. So.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting that you bring up the aspect of time with that as well, like the day to day and then like the long process associated with that experience. So you think a lot about like the physicality of the body in space in this work, but that aspect of time is really interesting too, because you're doing these cyanotypes with long exposures. So could you maybe unpack a little bit the process behind these pieces and cyanotype in particular?
Yeah, very much. So cyanotypes, for those who are watching who may not be familiar, they're called a photogram, which is like a subset of photography. Really, they're where photography got their start, because photograms are analog photography processes. And there's a lot of different types of photograms. The one that people would probably be most familiar with is daguerreotype, which is what's credited as being the first form of photography. But photograms are often also called cameraless photography because, and this is what differentiates them from photographs. That's why they're called photograms, because they don't use a contained camera body and lens to create the image. They use a light sensitive emulsion and objects and a more ambient light source to create them. So it's really like a more open air version of creating photographs, because it's not like a contained system. But again, this is how photography really started, right? Daguerreotypes were this exact same process of a emulsion on a surface, not like a contained camera body. So anyway, so cyanotypes are one type of photograms. They were created in 1842 by this guy named John Herschel, who's a British chemist. He's credited with a lot of different like analog photography processes. He's like a chemist. I think he just received a lot of crown money to like continue to do lab work and research, and so he found a lot of these things. But he's the one that's credited with it. And so it's really, it's about as old as photography gets. Cyanotypes are. Um, and I started using them though in 2020. This really, cyanotypes really became a COVID project that just didn't go away for me. Prior to the pandemic, I was making these like large scale installation based artworks, which I really enjoyed doing. But when going to the studio was like no longer a safe option for me, I lost my ability to create these installations because like I didn't have the space necessary to do so. Um, and what's really cool about cyanotypes is that they're very low tech. A lot of other analog photography processes require dark rooms because you have a lot of different light sensitive solutions that you need to work with to develop your photograph. And of course, cyanotypes are light sensitive, but they're not nearly as sensitive as a lot of the other ones. And they're also all water based. So you really don't need the same amount of equipment that you do for other analog processes. Um, the saying that I like to tell people about with cyanotypes is that if you have the sun in a sink, you can make a cyanotype because it's light sensitive and it's water based. So really, you don't need a lot of equipment to do them. So that's why that's part of the reason why I started working with them in 2020 is because they're really low tech and very accessible. But the other reason that I really liked making that switch, which kind of ties into this question about time, is that I was part of this privileged class of people in 2020 that was unemployed because of the pandemic and receiving unemployment benefits. So I was able to stay home and stay safe, and I didn't have to leave the house except to like go to the grocery store and like very, very essential trips, which of course was a privilege that kept me very safe, but also it really warped my sense of time, like spending days and days on end at home, really doing nothing much but like playing video games with my brothers and like riding my bike sometimes, like I really wasn't doing much. And so the the really metric sense of time that we work by normally, where it's like, okay, today is Sunday, it's 6:40 p.m., it's in May 26, 2024, right? Like this really regimented way of structuring time that we normally work by really started to lose a lot of importance for me. It was really like, oh, it's been 4 days since I last went grocery shopping. Like that was like how I measured time. It wasn't like today is Sunday. It was like, I don't know, it's 4 days since the grocery store.
Right.
My sense of time was really organic is the term that I use. It was a very organic sense of time. And that's why I also really gravitated towards the cyanotypes, because cyanotypes are an analog, open air photography process. And so it really felt like a good like conceptual parallel to the way that I was perceiving and feeling the world at that time. So it really started from like a temporal exploration, honestly, this entire body of work. It was like a deconstruction of metric time into more organic senses of time. And that's something that still is very important to the work today. And that's why a lot of times people will misnomer my artworks as paintings. And although I do recognize that there's a lot of painterly aesthetics within the artworks, there's still a lot of conceptual importance that is derived from like the use of cyanotypes. And so it's really, really important that people understand that these are photographs, they're not paintings. Because now it's still very much tethered to the pandemic. I mean, anything that was started then and is continued now is going to be tied together. But the work now is much more about constructing historical narratives and the ways in which data and information is manipulated to construct these narratives. So the cyanotypes, since they're a photography medium, they record time and place information with each exposure. I mean, the advent of digital photography has allowed us to see the metadata embedded in each photograph, right? Like you can look at a digital photograph now and see when it was taken, what the exposure and f-stops and ISO were, and a lot of times even where it was taken, like the geography of where it was taken. Like the advent of digital photography lets us, see that very plainly. But even in, more, I don't know, more traditional, more archaic forms of photography like cyanotypes, that information is still present. We just don't have a way to like extract it in the same way. And so each of these artworks begins by layering like, I don't know, 4 or 5 different exposures within the fabric. And I think about that as like sediment within a riverbed where there's like this constant flow that's just depositing little like layers of sediment until eventually like you'll have this like thick loam of just really rich information. And that's really like the starting point for each of these artworks, is like building up that set of information that can then be altered and manipulated later. So again, it's all still very temporal, at least in different ways than it was 4 years ago, but it's still very temporal. Like that process of embedding information through a time-based medium is very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the layer, you mentioned the layering. So the blue that comes from the cyanotype process itself is in all of these. And then you introduced other colors to these as well. So can you talk maybe a little bit about those color choices and how you go about making them?
Yeah, very much. So for those who also may not know cyanotypes very well, they're called cyanotypes because they come in one color, which is that blue color that you see throughout almost all of these artworks. And that's actually where we get like the name for the color cyan is from cyanotypes. The two salts that are in cyanotype are potassium ferrocyanide and ammonium ferric citrate. So there's cyanide in one of those salts, which is like part of the compound that like the bluish navy blue color that's in all these artworks is developed cyanotypes, which is called ferric ferrocyanide. So cyanide is like part of the salt that creates the blue color that you see. So anyway, that's like where we get the color cyan from. It's from cyanotypes. And it's like a really beautiful color. A lot of times it's called like Prussian blue is like probably the most common way that you would see it. Like if you were to buy a tube of paint, it would be called Prussian blue. It's a very beautiful color, but it is just the one color, since it's just a very specific chemistry that creates the cyanotypes, you can't just like change it up a bit and get a different color. Like it only works in one way, and so, like after a while of working with the cyanotypes, I like just from a purely aesthetic sense, I wanted to have more chroma to work with. And since I work on since I create these artworks on a textile substrate, these are all made on cotton. All of the other colors are derived from textile dyeing. So I use cold water, like synthetic dyes for all of my textile dyeing. And of course, there's a lot of different like practices and processes of textile dyeing, but that cold water dyeing is just what I found works best for me. So really, pretty much every color that you see other than the blue is like an artificially introduced color from the textile dyeing. And that started, I don't know, maybe 2.5 years ago now, something like that. And initially, the motivation there was purely aesthetic, in that I wanted more chroma to work with within the artworks. But the process that I use to dye the artworks is called wax resist dyeing. So here at the studio, I have a hot plate, which is kind of in the background. Maybe you can see it, but I have a hot plate back here, which I'm melting wax on. And wax is a lot like oil and water, where they're very much, diametrically opposed. And so wax resist dyeing is just simply the process of painting wax onto the textile and then letting it cool. So that way, when you apply the dye to it, the wax resists the dye and it preserves the colors underneath. And so that's how you get like this, you get these selected areas of dyeing throughout all of the artworks, is because I've applied wax to those areas to preserve the underlying color. And then I've dyed it, and then I've removed the wax afterwards. But I really like using that process of wax resist dyeing because it allows me to work within the existing imagery. Like cyanotypes are photography process, so all of the imagery within the artworks is created from that photography process, but then a lot of the chroma is created from the dyeing process. And like working with wax resist dyeing allows me to preserve the like structure of the imagery, but it allows me to alter the pigmentation of it, which I think really ties in conceptually very well, where like working with an existing outline, but altering the pigmentation to make it, a more, I don't know, cohesive or more aesthetically pleasing, or whatever you want to use. You can take it to whatever end you like, but I think that concept of working with an existing imagery, but altering it to fit your end goal is very important. And I really like doing it. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit as well about that imagery, about the figures in your work? And you have a really cool way of getting those figures to exist. Can you unpack that process a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So the imagery is all figurative. It's like more or less figurative, I guess. I mean, like some of the pieces hardly look figurative anymore because they've become so splintered. But since it's a photography process, all of the imagery starts all of the imagery is based off of real objects, right? So upstairs here at my studio, I have a second level, which I call just my cyanotype factory, because the cyanotypes are a really passive process, right? Like the dyeing, the waxing and the dyeing that I was just speaking about, that's a very active process in which like I have to be the one instigating this change. But the layering of these images to create the like rich bed of information, that's like a very, very passive process. I mean, it's really just a matter of painting the emulsion onto the surface and then letting the exposure run and taking it down afterwards. Like it's a very hands-off process. And so the imagery is just derived from pinning up the textile on a wall upstairs, and then I have these full-scale mannequins that the word that I use is choreograph. I like stack them around at like different heights and in different proximities to one another. I kind of just like stage them around, and I run an exposure with like one choreography of these figures, and then when I run a second exposure, I usually change the choreography around again. And so, the imagery that you're looking at is really just like 6 different exposures superimposed atop one another. And that's how you get this like fragmented figurative imagery, is it's just like one set of silhouettes superimposed over and over and over again until it like disintegrates. And that's why I say some of like it's all figurative imagery, but some of them are like more apparently figurative than others, because if you continue to superimpose chaotically choreographed images atop one another, eventually it will just like completely dissipate. And that's what some of the pieces look like, is some of them look like almost completely non-objective abstract pieces, because they've disintegrated, like the imagery at least has disintegrated so completely.
Right. It's like, I love the terminology you're using, like that sediment has built up enough that it's further abstracted. And I love that word choreography too. Because it's almost as if in the hanging of these pieces, which is very deliberate and very purposefully thought out by you, it's almost as if you're choreographing the pieces in the space as well. So could you share a bit about, in your statement, you talk about, secondary locales and overlooked spaces and non-traditional venues. Can you talk about that in relationship to the hanging of this show?
Yeah, definitely. So these works almost completely avoid existing on just one wall. I mean, there's like 4 pieces in the show that like sit flat on one wall, but but all the rest of them are, jumping between walls or straddling corners or draping between the wall and the ceiling. And that was something that, was, I mean, very much tied to that idea of body jumping, in which it's always kind of it's existing as one body between 2 places, and that's what this like staging of the exhibition is really about. Is all of these pieces are created from one piece of fabric, right? Like they're all one continuous artwork, but it's existing in 2 different planes, and that really seemed to mirror the idea of body jumping really well for me. And it also just like, I don't know. I think about like for my own self, the places in which I feel most comfortable and most at home and most myself as a trans person are like non-normative places. It's like being with other queer people and being with other trans people. And it just, all of the places that I feel most myself are places that, are not on the top 10 things to do in Atlanta list, like that's not where I feel the most comfortable. And so thinking about this exhibition, I was like, okay, if I'm going to make this exhibition about me being trans, I don't think it should be about like cleaning up nice to sit flat on the wall, right? Like, I don't think that that's what this exhibition is about. I think this exhibition is about where I feel most comfortable. And if most comfortable is the non-traditional spaces, then we're going to make artworks that fit in the weird nooks and crannies of the gallery.
Beautifully said. Yeah. Yeah. So I really appreciate the conceptual rigor and depth of your work on this exhibition. And the more we talk, the more that depth is apparent. And you're also a really accomplished writer. Talk a little bit maybe about how your writing relates to your artistic practice. And write to unpack your ideas at all, or what that looks like for you.
I honestly don't know if writing has a huge impact on my artistic practice. Like, because the writing that I do is mostly art criticism, and I don't know, I mean, I guess it has like some kind of an impact. Like, art criticism is really almost academic in a lot of ways, where you're writing, you have a thesis, right, where you basically you view an exhibition and you have some kind of argument that you have like created about this exhibition, and writing a review is really just like presenting your argument, whatever that argument may be. And so in a lot of ways it's like almost academic and kind of formal. Like, there is opportunity for like more poetic moments within art criticism at least, but it's really not like the focus of the writing. And I definitely don't do any creative writing, like that's why I even hesitate to call myself a writer at all, because like I feel like I write such a small, limited number of things, like if you
Yeah.
ask me to like write a novel or something like that, like I could definitely not do that. I don't know. Well, I mean, I haven't tried, but like, and maybe I should try it someday. But anyway, um, but like, so I think it has, I guess, some parallels in that within the artworks that I make. Um, I think of all of the artworks as narrative, even though they're not narrative, I guess, in the traditional sense, where like there's pictorial elements that like clue into one another to create some kind of larger extrapolated meaning. It's definitely nothing like that, but it's narrative in the sense that, you know, once this like rich bed of information has been created, the second half of the process of like dyeing and waxing and dyeing the artworks is really about extracting information. I think of them as like archaeological digs where I'm kind of digging through this information and I'm isolating elements that I want to highlight and isolating elements that I want to erase and isolating elements that I want to obscure. And that part of the process is really where it becomes narrative for me, where you're working with a large data set or you're looking with a large set of information and then you're manipulating it to create some kind of end result. And that, for me feels narrative. So I guess that's a parallel between the writing and the artwork in that, you have like some kind of central thesis and you have some kind of central end goal and you're kind of manipulating the information to achieve that. But I mean, outside of that, really, like, I don't know if it has a huge impact on me other than like on the studio practice, at least, other than it like keeps me sensitive to art. I mean, honestly, I think about art writing as just kind of like a way of contributing to the art community. It's not really like I enjoy doing it, of course, right? Like I wouldn't do it if I didn't like doing it.
Yeah.
But it's really for me, it's more about community than anything else. Where um, especially in the South, there's just like a dearth of both art writers and art criticism. And I seem to have found myself in the unique position where I am writing for publications and like I just keep getting pitches approved. And so like, okay, I guess I'll just keep doing this, like I don't know. Like it was never something that I like really set out with like I never had like a focused intent on doing this. Just kind of like came about in a way, but I do think that it really provides a very important service for the community. And I think maybe that's like a way that it relates to the studio practice also, is that like that sense of community is really important because I mean, one of the things that I like about the artworks that I make is that the figures are all anonymous, and not only anonymous, but they're also negatives, because the cyanotypes are created by placing an object in front of a surface. And so the area that is exposed to light develops, but the area that is not exposed to light doesn't develop. And so like the imagery that you're looking at is really a silhouette. It's not a figure, you're looking at the absence of a figure. So it's not only an anonymous figure, it's also like it's a void that you're looking at. And that sounds like kind of creepy and apocalyptic or something like that, like ghostly, which like it kind of is, like artworks are kind of creepy to some extent. But I also think that it's important because it's just a hole that anyone can fill. And so I think that like acknowledging the fact that this is a empty void that any one person could step into really emphasizes the universality of this, even if I'm speaking from like a very particular, in this case, a very trans point of view. Like I think keeping that universality is very appropriate and open. And that is something that I think art writing also does, is that it like emphasizes the community building. So
Absolutely, yeah.
mhm.
Yeah, along those lines of this like archaeological process, as you're putting it, like you're going in with a great deal of intention, and then there's also an element of discovery. So I'm curious about your relationship with like spontaneity and planning in your process, because a lot of aspects of it are considered and planned out in a way, there's an order of operations for a lot of these things. But then
Mm,
working with this fabric and manipulating it and discovering how you'd like it to hang on the wall. Are there
mm.
elements of surprise and discovery or any challenges in that process too?
Yeah, that's a good question. The really there's a lot of chaos in the first part of creating all of these artworks, a lot of very intentional chaos. As I mentioned, the cyanotypes are a really passive process, right? Like they're time based, they're not labor based. So there's nothing that like I as the artist can do to make the cyanotypes go faster or work more efficiently or develop quicker. Like there's nothing that I can do. It really is just a hands off, let time run process. And because of that, I think I also use that as an opportunity to introduce spontaneity within the artworks. In that, I mentioned that I like choreograph the mannequins when I'm creating each of these exposures, but like it really is only choreographed only so far as to prevent duplicate exposures, if that makes sense. Like I'm really only manipulating it enough that each exposure is different. I'm not manipulating them in such a way that I'm trying to control the final imagery. Like the intent is for each successive exposure to become increasingly more chaotic. And that's something that I think just really mimics the ways in which the flow of information exists in our world, where there really is no controlling the flow of events and information, right? Like we're just constantly being inundated with things, and that kind of uncontrollable flow is something that I really try to mimic in that first part of the process, where it's different enough that it's different, but it's not so controlled that it's contrived.
Mhm.
And that's really where like the spontaneity comes from. And that's also why I tell people that I don't really look at the artworks until the exposures are complete, because I don't really have anything to work with until the exposures are done. Like intentionally, I don't have anything really to work with until the exposures are done. I want it to be a completely like chaotic, hands off process up until the point that I start excavating the information. So the
Mhm.
first half is like really chaotic and it's really all over the place. And then the second half of the process is really very controlled, because I really don't ever like expose the artworks again after I've started to manipulate with like the waxing and the dyeing. I don't really go back into it afterwards. Like sometimes occasionally it does happen, but like really it doesn't. Really it's like I build up this information and then I like pull it apart and then it's finished. Um, and so that part of the process is really very controlled. Like in this exhibition especially, I think it was very controlled because I had generally an idea for how I wanted each of the artworks to be sculpted in the space, and then I like altered the imagery to fit that like sculpted shape. That's not always the way it works out. Sometimes it's more I just start working and then eventually the sculpted shape comes afterwards. But this one was very, very intentional because I knew I wanted it to fit the space in a very particular way. After I created the imagery, it was very much a process of, I guess, ideating the final shape of the artwork and then manipulating the imagery to fit that shape. So,
Nice. Yeah, it's nice you get a little bit of both. Like you get this element of chaos that you can respond to, and then this more controlled aspect. Um,
mhm.
so you also have another show going on in Atlanta right now at Hawkins headquarters called Sacrificial Surface.
Ooh.
Would you want to touch maybe on that exhibition as well and its relationship to this one, maybe the differences, what makes them distinct? And then also that title, so you have Sacrificial Surface, some of the works in this exhibition, share that title, and then Selective History.
Mhm.
Touch on those.
Mhm. Yeah, so the show that's up at Hawkins headquarters here in Atlanta is another solo show. The space is smaller than the Ellis Gallery is, so it's four works that are on view at Hawkins HQ. And that exhibition, I was also very intentional with the creation of the artworks. The owner of the gallery, Alexander Hawkins, he really emphasizes exhibition design within all of his programming. He wants people to create more like installations or immersive or experimental works within the space. It's a commercial space still, so he does sell things, but he really wants to emphasize that kind of like experimental, immersive quality to the artworks. Um, and so when thinking about that exhibition, I had that in mind. And also the back wall of the gallery, the floor plan for that gallery is a long rectangle like this. And the back wall of the gallery has these like accordion fold doors that can open completely. And so really the whole back wall of the gallery can open up to just like let air in, which is really beautiful. It's like a gorgeous space. But the cotton that I work on is really, really lightweight. Like it's a sheer cotton weave. Um, so it's really, really lightweight. Like even the works that are hanging in the Ellis gallery, like if you walked by them quickly, like you could see ruffles, like they're very responsive to ambient air movement. And so for that exhibition, I really wanted that like the flowing aspect of the substrate to really be emphasized. So all of the artworks, well, almost all of the artworks in that exhibition are hung from curtain rods. They're not mounted to panels like the artworks in this exhibition are, much like the two sacrificial surfaces that are in Bodyjumpers, very much like that, where they're hung from curtain rods. And so like the surface is really free floating. And so that ambient movement of air like really affects the surfaces, and that's something that I really wanted to emphasize within that exhibition. And those artworks in the Ellis Gallery right now and the entire exhibition in Atlanta right now, they're called sacrificial surface because the artworks have had like parts of the substrate removed. It's a textiles substrate, and so they have a weft and a weave, which is just like the two directions of any woven substrate. And so for those all of those artworks, I have selectively removed areas of this weft or weave, which is really it's something that's like kind of new to my practice that came about. I started experimenting with that like a little over a year ago now, something like that. And it's something that I really like because I've mentioned the word extraction a whole lot and erasure a whole lot because those are two methods by which historical narratives are frequently constructed. It's not always just intentionally including certain elements within your story. Sometimes it's also about intentionally excluding elements, right? Like intentionally erasing parts of a story so you can tell the story you want to tell. And so those two techniques are really prevalent within my practice. But like the dyeing is a very much a visual way of either extracting or erasing elements, but I really wanted to have a way to physically do so because sometimes erasure exists only in the more superficial ways, such as like not having proper representation within states based off of demography, or not choosing to, I don't know, I guess center women's voices in history books or something like that, right? Like sometimes it's more superficial where it's not a physical act of erasure, it's more visual act of erasure. But sometimes it is a very physical act of erasure, right? Like one of the touch points that I bring up every time is I think about Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was a thriving Black neighborhood in the 1900s. And it was an all Black neighborhood. It was affluent and it was thriving in Tulsa. But this was mid 1900s in the United States, in which de facto racism was still very much a thing. And so this thriving Black community was very intentionally violently erased from the community in Tulsa. And it hasn't like completely been obliterated, right? Like there's still ruins of this community, but it was a victim of racialized violence. And it's a very physical act, that act of erasure, right? Where it was a very intentional physical destruction of something that was seen as othered or undesirable, right? And so like this process of removing part of the substrate really mirrors that physical violent process of removing things from your stories, your narratives, where it's not always just visual. Sometimes it is very much about physically removing things that you don't want.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you as well, what is your hope for what people might take away from this exhibition, or what are some of the responses that you have gotten that really resonated with you?
Hmm. Well, it's been reassuring to see that there's like queer and trans people who are showing up at this exhibition, you know? I mean, I was a student in Savannah once upon a time, and I was like a baby trans person at the time, so I wasn't really like out and comfortable with myself in the way that I am now. Um, but it's really reassuring to see that there is an active and yeah, an active and participatory queer and trans community in Savannah. Like that's really very cool to see. I'm like this the exhibition Sacrificial Surface and this exhibition Bodyjumpers is kind of like a new it's kind of like a new phase of my artistic practice in which I'm really centering my personal narrative more than I ever have before. By and large, historically, I've always tried to find ways in which I situate myself within larger ideas or larger movements, which I do think is very important work that artists need to do. But I do think it's also very important to like address the ways in which the peculiarities of your perspective, I guess would be the way I would put it. Um, I think you can situate yourself within a larger context, but you're always going to be viewing it from your particular angle of entry. And so, like, these two exhibitions have really been a very active effort to like address the peculiarities of my perspective in a big way. And that's why like I've chosen to center my trans identity so much within this exhibition because it's not something that I ever have before. So I don't know if there's like a whole lot that I want anyone else to get from this exhibition, which sounds really selfish, but I do think that I don't know. I think that people really appreciate honesty and transparency within artworks. And I think that, addressing my own identity is a way of doing that. So.
Right. Yeah, just authenticity through the work and just presenting that. Yeah.
Mhm.
So speaking of that larger context, is there anything else out in the world that's inspiring you right now at the moment? What else do you look at for inspiration?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do a lot of reading. Like,
Yeah.
I do a lot of reading, which honestly, I think reading affects my studio practice more than my writing does, to be honest. Because I read a lot of what's called literary fiction, which is fiction that's set in a world very much like our own, and it's very character focused and character driven. So like reading the books, like it almost reads exactly like an anecdote from somebody in the year 2024, but it's like a fictional person and a fictional you know cast of characters, but it's like set in like a real world place. Anyway, like that's the type of book that I read most is literary fiction. And like reading, I feel like is where I get like those are the narratives that I consume most. And I think that is the way I think those are the narratives that really kind of digest and come out in the artworks because I'll read a narrative that I really, really like, and then I'll think about that in relation to the artwork.
Mm.
And as you can probably guess, I do spend a fair bit of time reading like women authors or Black authors or queer authors because my work is about minorities and silenced voices. And so, like, I make active efforts to do that or to digest that within the reading that I do. So, like, honestly, reading is like a big, big, big part of my inspiration. I'm a big library girly. Like I always have books. So
Awesome.
so yeah, reading is a big thing.
Yeah, so little plug for the last issue of Impact. We had a feature with
Mhm.
Leia, a couple features, like a visual feature, taking a look at your studio practice, and then your like top 10 list of books of last year. So check that out on
Mhm.
our website. You'll see some of
Yes.
those recommendations. Um,
Mhm.
so what's next for you? Is there anything else you'd like to plug or share?
Yeah, well, I mean, so the exhibition at Hawkins HQ continues until June 8th. So if anybody sees this before then and you find yourself in Atlanta, go see that because it's it's not like a, you know, a diptych of this exhibition in Savannah, but it's important in the same way, you know. So I would definitely see that if you have time. This later this year, I have an exhibition in Athens opening like end of August, something like that. There's this space called Foyer run by Jamie Bull, which is like kind of a new space. She opened it last year. I think I'm gonna be like her third or fourth exhibition in the space, something like that. But that opens at the end of August, and that'll be up for like 3 months. And then I mean, this will be much more relevant for the viewers in Savannah. In October of this year, I have another exhibition in Savannah opening. One of SCAD's galleries called Gutstein Gallery, which is on Broughton Street, down near the end of the street. I'm going to be in a two-person exhibition with this painter called Marcus Dunn, and that opens like October 8th, October 18th, something like that, one of those two dates. So those are the things that I'm most currently working on at the studio right now, are those two exhibitions. So,
It's fantastic. Well, it's really a wonderful exhibition, both visually and conceptually. It's so strong, it's so powerful. And there's still a little bit of time to see it. So for those of you who have not, it's on display here at Art Southeast 2301 Bull Street in Savannah, through June 15th. And we'll have a big closing reception for it on Friday, June 7th, which is First Friday, here in the Starland district. So Leia, thank you so much for joining us.
yes, thank you, of course.